I'd just like to make a couple of comments about this film. First of all, I was involved in an action very similar to these actions, similar to the one especially in Catonsville, Maryland, in May of 1969. We burned draft files in Chicago, and one of the reasons why we selected the south side of Chicago, there were 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago. And we wanted to bring out, by our physical destruction of those files and by the symbolism involved, that the draft was taking as cannon fodder to Vietnam to kill 1 million people in Vietnam. They were taking an extremely disproportionate number of black people and Hispanics and poor whites. So that was one reason why we chose the south side of Chicago, to help to bring that out. Also, I wanted to mention that I was just at a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Milwaukee 14. That's another action that is covered in this film. So there were a series of actions involving the burning of draft files. Now, we went further in doing that. We were pushing the envelope of nonviolence, pushing the envelope of nonviolent civil disobedience. We were moved very much by Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others who had been involved in the civil rights movement, but they never destroyed any property. We did. We destroyed it for the reasons that you saw explained in the film, that it was sending young men, the draft was only for men, and as I said, a disproportionate number of poor whites, blacks, and Hispanics from the south side of Chicago to Vietnam. So we destroyed property. Now that's an issue that you might consider in your studies. That's different from other kinds of civil disobedience, other kinds of nonviolent civil disobedience. We considered our act nonviolent, but others did not. So there's an issue there to study and to discuss. But I wanted to mention that we had this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Milwaukee 14. We have our 50th coming up next May 25th of next year. Imagine 50 years since something like that, and we're still celebrating. I mean, this is quite remarkable in itself, I think. You know, you do an action like that, some people would say, well, you know, I did that, it was kind of a crazy thing. I spent 2 years in prison studying my seminary theology studies. I was ordained a priest here at Jesuit a year after I got out. But some people would say, well, forget about that. It was terrible. We ended up in prison. It was probably a goofy thing. No, we're celebrating. I think that's significant in itself. And it was a joyful celebration in Milwaukee, full weekend. In the movement for justice and peace, you meet some incredible people. You meet people that will be your friends and allies and confidants for the rest of your life. That's one of the beauties, one of the great values of being involved in struggles. And I'm not just pushing civil disobedience. I mean, although it's very current, there's some interesting actions going on right now in these days in Detroit. So it's still very much with us. It's a tactic, as was said in film. It's not the only thing that we can do. Sometimes it may not be the indicated thing to do. We want to be effective. If not, then we're letting down the people who are suffering from the injustices that we're trying to protest and correct. I mean, if you're not going to be effective, then you're not doing anything with them and for them. Now, tell me, what is it you are planning to do with your one wild and precious life? Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you are planning to do with your one wild and precious life? Part of my agenda for being here, and it's not a hidden agenda because I'm stating it, I'm hoping that this meeting will help all of us to grow in our commitment. Our commitment to be compassionate towards the victims of society, towards people who are suffering, and our commitment to struggle for justice. So what is it that you will do with your one wild and precious life? Or what will any of us do with what remains of our life? What will you do with your one wild and precious retirement? Or your wild and precious weekends? I would like to mention that I have 2 videos that go into this. So they're called My Involvement in the Struggle for Peace and Justice. I have 2 videos on YouTube, and I'm going to probably not repeat too much of what I said in those videos. If you're interested in me or interested in particular issues, you can see those videos and learn a little bit more about some of these issues, especially about the burning of the draft files and some other acts of civil disobedience that I've been involved in over the years, a few things. So I'll try not to repeat those. I thought I would go back into a kind of remote part of my history. You know, when we say, how do people get involved in this sort of thing? What is the trajectory? What is the psychological and emotional development? And as I think back about my home life in New York City, we lived in Astoria, New York. We lived in a little flat. There were just 4 of us in the family, my sister Irene, who was a nurse, my mother and father. 4 rooms, their bedroom, which was connected to the living room, a hall going back past the kitchen, and the room that I shared with my sister. We did not want for any of the basic necessities of life. We had a good education at the parochial school. We didn't lack when we got sick. We could go to the doctor, we could go to the dentist. But we were not living extravagantly, and for me, I think that is an important part of my background. That Irene and I did not get addicted to materialistic consumerism from the time of our childhood on. We were not. I mean, you have a right to the basic necessities, things that you need. But I think many children now are getting addicted to consumerism, and they feel that their every want, which they consider their every need, but it's their every want, their every desire must be fulfilled. And in many homes, that's the case. The parents have the wherewithal to do that. And so they grow up then to be addicted to a very high level of consumerism. And I think one problem with that is that if you're addicted to a high level of consumerism, if you're convinced that you need to earn, I don't know what the figure would be now, $100,000, $200,000 a year, then you will devote all your work to that, to realizing that goal. And there will be no time then to work in solidarity with the poor, to work in struggles for justice. So as I look back, I think that was an important part of my background, that we lived in a modest home. But more importantly, in a way, was the love that Irene and I received from our parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts and our teachers. That's important because children, young children, I think we're aware of the extreme importance of early childhood development. And if a child does not receive love and does not receive care and does not feel secure in his or her home, then he will constantly be trying to boost up his self-esteem, perhaps at the cost of others. He or she will not be free to go beyond himself and focus his heart and his mind and his love on others. I think there's a very important connection there. How do we grow as people in our capacity to love? How do we exchange our hearts of stone for hearts of flesh? Well, a lot of it has to do with the love that we receive, because if not, we're always on the defensive about ourselves, we're always trying to build ourselves up, always feeling that people are out to get us, and maybe in the experience of many people, maybe that's true. So as I think back on my experience, I'm grateful for those 2 aspects. The material level was very modest in our home. We were not poor, we were not in the sense of suffering want, But there was no way that my sister and I could say, well, I want 5 or 6 gifts for Christmas and 10 for my birthday, and if I don't, I'm going to run a temper tantrum. And then the love that we receive, which I think is important. All of us need that. All of us need to be loved and cared for. Then moving along, I would say the same thing about our teachers and the importance of teaching. Those of you maybe going into teaching, we had nuns, sisters, at Our Lady of Mount Carmel School in Astoria, New York, who were quite demanding and were not always pleased with my particular comportment or behavior. One sister had taught my mother and my aunts and uncles at the same school. Well, she had some conferences with mom that, you know, probably pretty critical of me. But I knew that they loved me. I knew that the teachers cared for me, and that they put some high expectations on. They had high expectations for me, and I think that was very important. So if we have good teachers who respect the children, respect the teenagers, and then we moved out to Detroit. My dad was he painted trucks for Silver Cup Bread, which was a big bread company many years ago, Silver Cup. He painted trucks. He was a great letterer. But then he got a promotion in the company, so we moved to Detroit. And my parents got me into the University of Detroit High School. There too, you know, they called us Mr. I think they're still doing that, I believe. Mr. Mulligan. Here we are, you know, 14 years old as a freshman. Somebody's calling you Mr. But more than just that term, they cared about us. They cared about how we were doing. They wanted to help us. They were demanding, very demanding, but that was mixed with a real care for the children, care for the teenagers. I came here to the University of Detroit, studied for 2 years. I was in pre-med because I thought that was a career that could, you know, where I could use my talents. I don't know if I would have made it into medical school, but use my talents and to be of service and help to others. I guess the idea that I had in high school when I thought about what I wanted to do was, it never occurred to me just to try to make a lot of money. You know, that, and I think part of my background in Astoria, New York, you know, contributed to that idea of what success in life would be. And I didn't define it for myself in terms of material success, getting rich, having this or that status symbol and all these things. I guess I thought in those days that I wanted to do something that I would enjoy doing, that would be in keeping with my talents, such as they were, that would be meaningful, something that would be meaningful. I wouldn't want to work 8 or 10 or more hours a day in a slavish kind of job, doing something meaningless just in order to make a lot of money. That to me would be a waste of most of my time. And something that would be useful to society. So something that would be enjoyable in the sense that I'd be using my talents in a proper way, something that would, this was not motivated by material remuneration, and that would be socially useful, something that would be helpful to people in need. So then with that I came here, and I was, as I said, I was involved in pre-med, and then I remember once, and this is kind of a personal liberation kind of experience. In those days at this university and other Catholic universities, Catholic students had to make a weekend retreat at least once a year. So I went, and I had a biology exam coming up that Monday, and I thought, well, I can't make this retreat. I'll sit here in the back and I'll just study my biology book, or no, it was organic chemistry. For me, that was a memory question. So I just I'll memorize all this, study all this in the back pew, and that's it. I have this exam on Monday. I ended up flunking the exam miserably because something happened during that weekend that I guess I came to the realization that if I just kept putting off the decision to become a priest, to become a Jesuit, probably a Jesuit, because those are the people that I knew, I could just put this off forever. You know, I figured now is the time to make a decision. And this, I think, can apply to people, not only if you're deciding to become a priest or sister or a member of a religious order. It can apply to all of us when we're faced with some challenging decision. You know, something that's uncomfortable, makes us uncomfortable, and you just tend to put it off. Maybe it would be to participate in a demonstration. Maybe it would be to participate in civil disobedience or to sign a letter. And that was something of my experience. And so finally, during that retreat, I said, well, I'm not running from this anymore. I'm going to try to face this and open my heart and mind to what the Lord is asking of me. And by the end of that retreat, I was feeling pretty peaceful about following that call. So it was an amazing experience of liberation, you know, for me. Liberation from my own fears and uncertainty, my own inertia, and you know, just the feeling that you don't want to get into this because you'll be leaving home, you'll be going into the seminary. But I was helped by the Spirit, I believe, to make that decision. And so it was a kind of liberation. Liberation has many aspects to it, because we have many addictions. Many addictions. We're addicted to alcohol, to opioids, to other kinds of drugs. We're addicted to the level of material consumption that we feel is necessary. And so to the extent that we're addicted, then we're not free. We're not free to really see the truth for us. And we're not free to follow the call. Whether that's a call to, as I said, get involved in a demonstration, or go to visit prisoners in the jail, where Jesus said he is. Visit people who are homeless, people who are immigrants into this country and who are homeless, being jailed, being separated from their families. We're not free to the extent that we're addicted. We're addicted to power, and we're addicted to wealth. So liberation, in a certain sense, begins in the human heart. It begins in the human heart. We have to get free ourselves of those chains and idols that make us less human, make us less than we could be. But it's not only in our own heart and mind. Liberation needs to be structural. We need to work for freedom for people, political freedom, social freedom, racial, gender, and so forth. So I entered the novitiate, and I began to consider some aspects of my life and my vocation, what I wanted to be as a Jesuit priest. And those were, in those years, the Second Vatican Council was going strong. The Second Vatican Council made a number of declarations. One was the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, where they said that the joys and sorrows of the world are the joys and sorrows of the church. That the church is not some separate temple sort of institution, not some separate world where we live in prayer and worship, but the church is a leaven. It's the yeast in the world, in the earth. And the church exists for the good of the people of the earth. Pope Francis has said that the church should be a field hospital, attending to all the wounded people in this world, attending to the lonely, attending to the sick, attending to the prisoners, attending to immigrants, and so forth. So that was an important influence on me, the Second Vatican Council, and the social dimension of our Christian commitment, the social dimension of our faith. And then I began to see that Jesus taught that the most important thing is love of God and love of neighbor. And where is the neighbor? Where is Jesus? In prison, in jail, in the immigrant, in the hungry, in the homeless, in the thirsty, in people who are being persecuted. That's what he said. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was sick, you visited me. And that's where God is. I think I was gradually coming to a belief and understanding of that. And then along with that, the Synod of Bishops in Rome made a statement in 1971. It said that work for justice is a constitutive, essential element of evangelization, of bringing the good news of God, the good news of Christ. Work for justice is an essential part of bringing the good news to people. And that really struck me, that moved me very much. So there's no way you can get away from the social demands, the demands of people. And we can look for escapes in religion. I've said sometimes in Nicaragua that you think it's possible that people can spend too much time in church? And people say, well, I don't know, too much time in church. No, maybe not. Well, you can. We can spend too much time in church. Because Christ is not only in the church, Christ is in the neighbor. He's in the person fallen, beaten up on the side of the road that the Good Samaritan comes along to, and helps materially and practically. So I began to see that, it's a Synod of Bishops of 1971. Now, I was in prison in 1971, so for the Chicago 15 draft board raid. So that was very consoling to me. I said, all right, well, I guess I'm here then for evangelizing, in this way. Evangelizing means literally bringing the good news of hope and love to people, evangelization. So work for justice is a constitutive, which means essential, element of bringing the good news to people. Then the Jesuits, a few years later, came up with a definition of our mission, which said that our mission as Jesuit priests and brothers is the service of faith. The service of faith, that is, teaching theology and religion and celebrating Mass and celebrating the sacraments, baptizing people and so forth, the service of faith, and the promotion of justice, which is an integral part of our ministry of faith. In May of 1969, we entered the draft boards at 63rd and Western in Chicago and paralyzed the operations of 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago. Tell me, what are we going to do with what remains of our life, our one wild and precious life? Now, a lot of people in the world don't have that choice as to what they're going to do as their livelihood, what they're going to do for their job. They're lucky if they do anything to make some money. But still, they have time to figure out what they want to do with their wild and precious leisure time, weekends. And I think all of us have that too. So just a few other elements that I wanted to touch on. Contact with people. You can't beat it. I mean, there's no way of getting around the need and the beauty and the joy of having contact with people who are suffering and becoming their friends and knowing their names and liking them and enjoying being with them. And then they're part of you. And if they're in jail, if they're migrants, immigrants coming here and in various kinds of detention, jails, you can't just drop them and get them out of your mind. And you say, well, these people are suffering and I know them. I know their names. I recognize, I know what they look like. I enjoy talking with them. And the poor, the people who are oppressed, racially, gender-wise, and so forth, they're suffering. And they're part of me. As St. Paul said, when one member of the body suffers, all suffer. The whole body suffers. But that comes from getting to know people. We have to get out of our islands in the suburbs. We have to do more than just go through the canyons of the expressways, getting through the city, but not seeing anything of it. Or going downtown, spending our time on the river walk, which I was doing with some of my friends. I wanted to get on one of those little scooters, but I just hadn't gotten the app. And I think that's the problem with the physical separation that the suburbs and certain enclaves in the cities cause. We're separated from people. And we don't get to know people who are suffering, people who are poor, people who are exploited. We don't get to know them personally, but there's no substitute for that as far as a lasting commitment. And then you're bitten. If you get to know people and you become their friends, you're bitten by the bug of friendship with them. And it won't let you go. You'll be thinking about them, and you'll be thinking, well, what can we do together? What can we do together? So contact, personal contact, I think is extremely important in the development of our compassion, exchanging our hearts of stone for hearts of flesh, according to Scripture, and in our commitment to struggle. Now, we can't get anywhere in any of these struggles if we don't organize. You'll only become frustrated, and you might probably give up if you're just trying to work alone. A great labor organizer in the Western States, Joe Hill. There's a ballad of Joe Hill. He was a union organizer out west, and his famous statement is very simple, but it sticks with you. Don't mourn, organize. Now many times we feel like mourning, weeping, grieving about what's happening in this country, or what's happening in Nicaragua. It's difficult. We don't win all of the battles by any means. We do win some. And that gives us hope. It gives us a feeling of making some progress. We do win some if you're smart about how you organize and how you take on certain issues. If you don't take on the whole world at once, and if you have good organizing with you and behind you that you're part of, we can win. And I think that also coming together as people around an issue, it's a beautiful motor, it's a beautiful force for community and friendship and struggling together.
Love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole heart, your whole soul, all your being. Love God. And then Jesus adds, drawing from a different book of the Hebrew Scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a very important part. In fact, later on, after the time of Jesus, one of the disciples, John, in his first letter to the early Christian community, pointed out to that community, if anyone says, I love God, but hates a brother or sister, that one is a liar. For whoever does not love a brother or sister whom you have seen cannot love God whom you have not seen. This is the commandment we have from God. Whoever loves God must love their brother and sister. That's why Jesus ties these two together. How can we love the God we can't see? How can we even relate to God? Jesus shows us the way. Love your brother or sister in whom God lives, who has created that brother and sister out of love, just as God has created each one of us. When we love our brother or sister, we are loving the God who brought them into being, who brings us into being. We can love the brother and sister we see, or we can choose not to love the brother and sister. And if we choose not to love, then John says, you are a liar if you say you love God.